turns out we haven't seen a lot of people in several years. Thank you.
You got caught. Good. All right, welcome. Good morning. Thank you all for coming here today. I'm Adam Hergis from the Mosaic Company, and our mission is to help the world grow the food it needs. As a fertilizer manufacturer, we recognize the role we play in nourishing crops, and we take that responsibility seriously from home and around the world. Over the past couple of years, the global agricultural sector has experienced one of the most disruptive periods in recent memory. When we last gathered in person in 2019, who among us would have imagined what the next 3 years were to hold? Collectively, we've faced a unique set of challenges for which there's no roadmap: a global pandemic, supply chain breakdowns, geopolitical turmoil that is disrupting food supply and access to vital nutrients. And of course, the run-of-the-mill concerns around extreme weather and drought impacting crops around the world. I think we can all agree that it's been a lot. It has also put a sharper point than ever on how intertwined we are as a global community. And it's been a wake-up call for all of us concerned with growing food. We must do more to put agriculture on the strongest footing possible to withstand these disruptions. We face a global imperative to build resiliency and sustainability for the future of food security. Innovation and collaboration is key, because we can't meet the growing demands of the world's population by standing still. This means looking at a whole host of ways agriculture can innovate and exploring and answering some of our most difficult questions. How can we increase yields while at the same time being responsible for stewarding the environment? Today, you look across the globe, nutrient use efficiencies are roughly around 46% for phosphorus and between 30 and 50% for nitrogen use. But here in the US, we're seeing closer to 70% in nitrogen use efficiency. So we still have a lot more work to do. How can we help farmers make the most out of every drop of available water and protect water supplies? How do we promote best agricultural practices and advance research? How can we support communities and regional agriculture to bolster food security? Answering these questions transcends the solutions any one actor can deliver on its own. It requires a true spirit of collaboration among all partners in agriculture. And in that spirit, we've gathered today with some of the leading voices from our industry, agriculture, and public sector. We're going to discuss some of the approaches and challenges to shore up food security, and we're going to explore the ways we can collaborate to achieve a sum greater than its own parts, because we all play a role, and we're all in this together. So I want to thank our panelists, our esteemed panelists here today. Thank you for joining us, Steve, Corey, Sean, and Dr. Fowler. To sort of start off the conversation, we'll kind of go around and introduce who you are. But I'm going to pitch the first question to you guys. What's the biggest lesson from the past 2 to 3 years? Dr. Fowler, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this on? No. Is it on now?
Is this one on?
It's not on when it's on. Okay, how about this? Great, thank you. My name is Kerry Fowler, and I'm the Special Envoy for Global Food Security
for the U.S. government, based at the U.S. Department of State. Biggest lesson. I think the biggest lesson for me coming into the State Department, as I did about 6 months ago, is just the high level of interdependence that we have in this world for food security. Another way of saying that is what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. We have 131 countries out of 196 that are net food importers. So this high level of interdependency in global markets introduces high levels of complexity. And that high level of complexity, frankly, makes dealing with these issues complex, difficult. You have to pay attention to weather, inputs, markets, basically everything. And all the news that you see on the television every morning and the crop reports that you get from around the world, the weather situation in Pakistan, whether or not this country or that country is going to put an export ban on certain crops, all of that factors into how at least the U.S. government has to react to these challenges.
Thank you, Dr. Borlaug. This mic's not working, so I'll stand up here. Sean.
How's this one? Yep. Okay. We'll get there. Well, thanks very much, Adam, and pleasure to be with you all this morning. So my name's Sean Babington. I am a senior advisor to Secretary Vilsack on climate change and natural resource issues at the U.S. Department of Agriculture at headquarters in Washington, D.C. I haven't been in Des Moines in about 25 years, so it's lovely, a little brisk. But, and it's great to be joining my fellow panelists up here. Dr. Fowler and I have been in similar orbits, but just starting to work together. Corey and I have worked together for a long time. I was on the Senate Agriculture Committee as a staffer when we confirmed Steve Sensky to be Deputy Secretary, and a fine job he did, and a wonderful person that he is, and a very capable one. So great to be with all of you. And I think that this is such a great way to tee off this discussion. We've got, and I'll channel Secretary Vilsack a little bit here. Over the last 2 years, we've learned a lot of things. One of them was that we, and particularly domestically, have created a very efficient food system, maybe not necessarily a very resilient one. We know how to produce a lot of food. We know how to produce it efficiently, cheaply, nutritiously. But when you have supply chain disruptions from a global pandemic, when you have conflict in parts of the world where there are a lot of inputs and actual commodities produced that get disrupted, when you've got, and this is a little bit more in my wheelhouse in the Secretary's office, when you've got climate impacts that scientists have predicted for years, but we actually haven't seen coming home to roost in the way that they have recently, all of that shows us that we need to build a more redundant, more resilient supply chain. I think about the Florida orange crop, which is pretty much gone. We'll have the lowest, USDA projected yesterday, we'll have the lowest Florida orange crop since 1943 because of the hurricane. I think about a 1,200-year drought across the West that doesn't show any signs of abating, and the disruption that's causing. When I worked on Senate Agriculture, I worked for Debbie Stabenow as the chairwoman of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Michigan, where she's from, is the tart cherry capital of the world. But we've seen several times just in the last 10, 12 years, an early spring, unprecedented early warm temperatures cause the cherry trees to bloom, and then a late frost wipes out 80, 90% of the entire cherry crop. That kind of stuff didn't used to happen, and we're seeing it more and more. So I've learned a lot of that over the last few years, and I think that we're seeing more and more of it.
Well, thanks, Adam. Corey Rosenbush. I'm the president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, and we learned a lot of lessons over the last couple of years. I would say first and foremost was really around where food comes from. I grew up in a small Texas town. My dad was an ag teacher, FFA advisor. We raised hogs, so I literally brought home the bacon when I was a kid. So my kids I've destroyed. They're city kids. They have no idea where their food comes from. And as COVID hit and we began to see disruptions in our food supply chain, I think it really created a heightened awareness among everyone about food and food production. And I would say even in the last year, even though Steve's farmers are not too happy with me, we understand how important fertilizer is to food production. We say that about 50% of the world's food is produced because of fertilizer. And so it is a critical ingredient, and without it and some of the disruptions we've seen, it's really created a heightened awareness, really, among everyone about how important food and agriculture and fertilizer is to feed the world. And it is critical to food security, and food security is critical to national security. Second lesson is just how interconnected energy and energy policy is to food production. So if you think about nitrogen fertilizer, its core component is natural gas. It's what is combined with the nitrogen from the air to produce ammonia, urea, UAN, et cetera. And I just think back to the freeze that we had in the South, and it shut down so many fertilizer plants and natural gas plants. It really did have a big impact because 85% of the cost of producing nitrogen fertilizers comes from natural gas, and about 60% of the nitrogen produced in the United States comes from that Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana area, because that's where our natural gas supply is. So all you have to do is look at Russia and what's going on right now in Russia, Ukraine. Early on, I say we kind of thought about this in three phases. One was, how do we get wheat out of Ukraine? Two, how are we going to get fertilizers out of Belarus and Russia? But it was really the third one that we said we should be paid most closely to, and that is the natural gas supply from Russia into Europe, where about 70% of all nitrogen fertilizer in Europe is now shut down because of that impact. So those would be our two big lessons learned, is really around awareness of food and how critical energy is to feeding the world.
Thanks, Corey. Steve?
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. Steven Sensky, I'm the CEO of the American Soybean Association. As Sean said, I also had the opportunity from 2017 to 2020 serving as the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. But probably originally, I want to go back and say I'm a farm boy from Minnesota, growing up on a soybean, corn, and diversified livestock operation, and have been involved in agriculture my career. I would say the biggest lesson, I agree with all of the comments made, but I want to go back to something that Sean mentioned, and that is the need for resiliency. That is probably the biggest lesson that I come away from this. We need greater resiliency in our supply chains. Certainly, we have seen what the shocks to the system have done because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion there. We've seen some countries respond with export controls, which is the wrong way to do that, not only on food, but also on fertilizers as well, and that has sent a shock through the rest of the world. You know, I probably received more calls on the whole fertilizer situation this spring than any other topic, where you had, you know, the prices of phosphorus and potassium that had doubled, nitrogen had tripled. But again, it is a complex situation, and it just shows what a shock to the system does. And I would also say that we need more resiliency in our agriculture production systems as well. As Sean mentioned, we are facing droughts. We're facing rainfall that still may be on average the same. In some cases it's more, but rather than getting an inch of rain a week, we're getting an 8-inch rain in 1 week, and then it goes dry for a long period of time. And I think we need really a lot of work on our agriculture production systems, not only here in the United States, but around the world, and research to see how can we have crops that are more tolerant of that, more drought tolerant. How can we make sure that we're using practices that are able to absorb those heavier rainfalls that come in a few hours at a time?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And that kind of jumps into, my next question for you guys is how do we tackle some of these challenges? And Steve, you talked about some of the ways we can do resiliency. Dr. Fowler, how do you think we can tackle some of these challenges?
Yeah, I grew up in Western Tennessee, and this will date me a bit, but I remember when the first tractor came to the family farm and half of the mules left the same day. And then I remember when the second tractor came, which was a John Deere, not to plug any particular one, but I was in love with that tractor. And another half of the mules left. My grandmother, who ran the farm, never trusted the tractors completely, so we always kept a pair of mules. That shows you how agriculture changes and how we innovate. And if you look at what's happened in the production sphere and in the plant breeding world, you'll see that in my lifetime, the yield of maize has gone up about 5-fold. It's not visible to us on a year-to-year basis, but it becomes visible when you encounter a global food crisis like we're talking about now. And there's a tendency, political and otherwise, to say, well, what's the fix for this? How can we solve this problem? We need to solve it instantly and ideally cheaply. But in fact, and I think this is one of the challenges we all face, we are, in a sense, solving these problems through large investments in agricultural research that pay off year by year because those improvements are in the pipelines. You miss them when you shut off the spigot to the funding for agricultural research. So one of the things that I guess I would say in direct answer to your question, Adam, is that we need to be mindful of making the proper and adequate investments in agricultural research, even if we don't see the payoff in a period of time of months. Because we are benefiting today, if you can imagine being in the food crisis of today with corn yields being what they were when I grew up. This would be a problem we definitely couldn't be solving today.
Yeah, Sean, and you talked a little bit about droughts and floods, climate change. How do you view we should tackle these issues?
Well, excellent question. I might want to just pick up really briefly on where Dr. Fowler left off. Funding for ag research, particularly some of the basic research, is just so fundamental to everything we're talking about here. I believe that in sort of constant inflation adjusted dollars, we're lower than we were in the 1980s in investing in basic ag research. And that has a ripple effect of implications really important to this discussion that we really can't forget about and have top of mind. One of the things that folks forget is that ag research is not like research in other sectors where it's kind of constant, you build on it, it's done, and now we can move on to the next thing. The world changes. We have crops that develop resistance to various inputs and pest control options. We have changing climate. We have a whole host of things we've already been talking about here. We need to continuously invest in there. And I think that, if there's one thing that fosters the innovation we want to be talking about in this panel, it's that we got to redouble our efforts on investing in ag research. So with that said, on the climate side, we're going to need a whole bunch of new advances to both adapt to a changing climate, which we've already sort of hit on a little bit, but also transform our food and ag sector to be responsive to a climate-constrained future, where we actually need to both adapt but also use an emitting sector, agriculture, to mitigate climate change. We have a new program at the Department of Agriculture called the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. And it's all premised on this idea that there's not only a sort of science imperative to reduce emissions across the economy, including from ag, but also a consumer imperative, a market imperative, where we've got folks at the grocery store and through the supply chain more and more interested in how their food was grown, what types of animal welfare standards were adopted in cases of livestock and other things, and in many cases willing to sort of pay a premium for things that were produced in sort of a more sustainable manner, whatever you define that as. We've put together a $3.5 billion grant program to foster innovation in that space, to ask producers to get together with trade groups, private companies, conservation groups, land-grant universities to say, how can we foster a greater penetration of these climate-smart production practices so we can have innovative solutions to the challenges of the future, both that are thrust on us by the market, but also just by the weather and by other things. So we're going to learn a lot from that program. The secretary just announced Secretary Vilsack, my boss, just announced the first round of awards under this program last month. $2.8 billion spread across 70 projects covering every state in the Union, DC, Puerto Rico, all remarkable partnerships to think about a more resilient, climate-smart agriculture system in the future. So we're going to learn a lot from that. I think in a year I can come back and give some lessons learned here, but it's an exciting time, and I think there's going to be a lot of innovation as we move forward.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of momentum now in the U.S. And, speaking on innovation, I know USDA and the Fertilizer Institute partnered on a recent sort of fertilizer challenge, right? And so continuing along the dialogue of innovation, Corey, what are you seeing as interesting innovations to strengthen agriculture and make it more sustainable?
Yeah, two actually now, I guess. So we had the EPA USD Next Gen Fertilizer program that's running, and then more recently the $500 million grant for fertilizer production capacity. A lot of innovation tied into climate smart practices. And what another lesson, if I could go back to the first question, was how do we be most efficient with fertilizer? And when you have a market like we have and prices, it really drives that message home. So whether it's for our nutrient stewardship that a lot of farmers will use, or new products, I think these are the kind of innovations that will be one of the solutions. We're never going to completely replace NPK, but some of these new technologies will supplement and make them more efficient. So biostimulants that will help address some of the weather challenges that we've talked about already. Other coatings, inhibitors. You've got nitrogen fixing technologies and microbials that are being introduced. So the pace of innovation is really fascinating right now in the fertilizer space. That will be a nice complement. And I get the question all the time, well, isn't this a threat to the fertilizer industry? Just take a look at what a lot of the large NPK producers are doing. They're investing in these technologies because they know it's a complementary innovation and tool to help with some of that efficiency. And I think that's really exciting when you think about it. One that we don't talk a lot about in the fertilizer world is low carbon ammonia. We've been paying attention to this and actually working on a standard around low carbon ammonia production. And back to that intersection with fuel, I think the application there is largely going to be as a fuel source. So as a hydrogen fuel source to use that H off of the ammonia production. But I think there's a fertilizer use maybe in the next 7, 8, 9 years as well. Early on, it's going to be a lot for shipping containers. It's going to be, Japan has announced they want to use it for energy production, locomotives in the rail industry. Really fascinating to see how some of these innovations are going to be used in just a stronger intersection. Now, from Steve's perspective, I think what we hear a lot about from farmers and what I hear over and over from retailers is the pace of products coming at them is so rapid, they can't sift through what works and what's snake oil. And I think that is where we all as an industry have our challenge with this pace of innovation.
Excellent. Steve, what do you see as interesting innovations and being, a leader within the farm group and the farm industry? What are you seeing? What maybe excites farmers today?
Yeah, there's really a great pace of introductions and a lot of innovations out there. And I think, some that I would mention that I think are really going to be key to helping us solve the dual challenge that we have to feed a growing world population while also addressing climate change. And that's, in one word, it's innovation. But we're seeing, lots of technologies. There's some of the technologies that Corey just talked about on fertilizer, biostimulants, coatings to reduce emissions, things like that. There is the equipment technology that is out there. A couple months ago, I was here back in the Des Moines for the Farm Progress Show, and really seeing some of the technology and equipment as well. Autonomous tractors, spray technology that can identify a weed from a growing crop and only spray the weed rather than having to broadcast spray. Companies working out there doing that. Drone technology, being able to have sensors that can tell whether a crop is beginning to be affected by either a nutrient deficiency or a pest, and can detect changes in the signals coming from the crop compared to something that our naked eye would not be able to see. And it's those kinds of early warnings. Those are the kinds of things that I think are really exciting and that are out there. But I guess I go back to, what was flashing on the screen, Adam, was that we're not on pace to meet the productivity. And as exciting as all of this is, and these new technologies, the GAP report, the Global Agriculture Productivity Report that just came out recently in the last few weeks, shows that the world, in both the developing and developed world, we're not on pace to meet growing food needs in the future. In fact, we're well behind the pace. We have to increase our total factor productivity by about 50% to try to get back on pace. And that should be a real wake-up call for all of us of what can we do. I agree that one of the things, and there's a number of things that I think we can do. One of them that was mentioned is increasing our funding for agriculture research. Unfortunately, here in the United States, we've fallen, our public spending on agriculture research in real dollars has fallen by about 1/3 over the last 30 years. So it's really unfortunate. And so we need to invest in our land-grant universities, our USDA programs of the Agriculture Research Service and NIFA, international agriculture development and research organizations as well. The other thing that I think we can do is make sure that we have the right regulatory regimes here in the United States and around the world that welcome innovation. And there's things that I think we can do is to make sure that our approach, our regulatory regime for gene-edited products, which is a great technology that I think really holds a lot of promise, but do we have a regulatory regime that, yes, confirms they're safe, but doesn't cost tens of millions of dollars so that only the 2 or 3 biggest companies in the world can afford the regulatory cost to do that? And if we don't get that right, if we stifle those technologies here in the United States and around the world, we're going to see a lot of university, a lot of entrepreneurs and startups that simply are not able to bring the technologies to market. So those are some of the things that I think we really need to do.
I would just echo that is a challenge, because when you talk about all these new products that are out there, one of the daily challenges we face is it regulated as a fertilizer? Is it a pesticide? What is it? And the good news is fertilizer is not regulated at the federal level. The bad news is it's regulated at 50 different states. And so trying to have some sort of a regulatory scheme that you talked about, Steve, to get these tools in the farmers' toolkits is really hard. And that is going to be critical to keep up with this innovation.
Mm-hmm. So, we talked about the challenges. Innovation is key. Partnerships and collaboration, right? So what are some specific programs or initiatives from your organizations and who you represent that you would like to speak about? in terms of how, building resiliency and innovation. And Dr. Fowler, I'll start with you.
Well, as I look out in the audience here, I see friends from Helen Keller Institute, from IECA, which I met with this morning, from EFAD in Rome. One thing that I think this current situation has done is to bring all of us together and to realize that we're not all out there, or shouldn't all be out there doing our individual little projects, but should be talking with each other about how to build critical mass to solve problems, not just to chip away at them. That's something that we at the State Department want to try to catalyze in the future. And I guess the example I would give would be an odd example. You might find it a little odd, and that is to talk a minute about Ukraine. What happened on February 24th when Russia invaded Ukraine? All of a sudden, we had a major agricultural exporter, a top 5 exporter of wheat, barley, sunflower, and corn, that wasn't able to export its food. The entire infrastructure of the country had been oriented towards exports through Odessa and the other ports, not overland. That had to be redirected. So if you talk about cooperation, one of the things I saw at the State Department was us getting down into the weeds, so to speak, about what kind of storage needs are Ukrainian farmers going to have. If the grain that was in storage that needed to be exported couldn't be exported, well, where is the incoming grain from the new harvest going to be put? And if there's nowhere to put it, let's talk about disincentives for planting more. Fertilizer issues, transportation issues, all of those things. And what I saw the U.S. government doing, not very visible to those of you in the audience perhaps, was many different agencies of the U.S. government coming together to try to figure out how to export those items overland, dealing with different, for example, with different rail gauges from one country to the next. So you could get it to the border, but you couldn't get it over the border. Storage facilities, both large scale, which Russia was bombing, as well as small on-farm storage. All of these had to be dealt with quickly, very quickly, and we had to marshal the resources of the U.S. government to do it. I'm glad to say that it's been largely successful. Obviously, we've opened up the grain route going out of the Black Sea ports, but there's no real assurance that agreement, which lapses at the end of November, will continue. So we on our side, and this I regard as global food security work, still working hand in hand with the government, with the farmers there, with the private sector there. I'm on the phone constantly with private sector that's involved with that. We're all working together to try to fashion a solution. This is not something that would have happened a few years ago, and I don't think we in this room typically engaged in as much cooperation and communication as we do now. But this is an all-hands-on-deck moment, and what I hope that will come out of it is the realization of the value of these kind of partnerships and collaboration that we have internally and with the outside world.
Sean, I know you touched on a few of specific initiatives and programs, but dive a little bit deeper on some of those initiatives.
Well, so I'm the Secretary's guy on climate. I also do natural resources, and I work very closely with our team that thinks about inputs, the fertilizer program, for example, that I mentioned, food security, nutrition here at home. And we've just got an outstanding, I think, story to tell across all the stuff that USDA does on how we're trying to foster more partnerships, more collaboration, including and particularly with a focus on folks that we haven't collaborated with before. So a couple examples. The Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities initiative that I spoke about a minute ago, not only required it not only encouraged a private sector match component, but it encouraged sort of non-traditional partners to band together in a way that they hadn't before. So on the match side, that's just sort of collaborations built into it, right? You've got a federal investment. Some of those projects are up to $100 million, but the ones that were most competitive, that received extra ranking points, brought a significant private sector match. I mentioned that this ultimately ended up being a $3.5 billion program. We received, it was initially slated as a $1 billion program, by the way, but the response was so overwhelming that Secretary Vilsack came back to us and said, can we expand the opportunity here? And we expanded to 3.5. The reason we did that is because for the initial $1 billion, we received $20 billion in full and complete compelling applications. So 20 times more resources than we had put out there. And that included $8 billion in private sector match, almost a 50% match for every federal dollar invested. So that leverages the federal investment to go further, get more practices on the ground. That was a really important component. One of the other things that we received in feedback when we first put out a request for information on this initiative, and then we incorporated in the program, was extra ranking points, including really a priority and emphasis on working with small, underserved, historically marginalized producers in these applications. And there's so much to be learned through those partnerships that USDA has historically not done a very good job acknowledging and taking advantage of some of that knowledge and that collaboration out there. So maybe give you two examples, one from the partnerships program, one from some of my work with the Forest Service. In the partnerships program, when the Secretary announced the first $2.8 billion, which I've referenced a few times, he asked us to put together an itinerary that would take him to 5 states in 4 days. That's a lot of work for the staff, as you might imagine, and the scheduling and advance team and the security detail. But it's a big deal, and it's a big priority program for him. I was along for the visit to Arkansas, where we did a tentative award to an incredible consortium of USA Rice, Ducks Unlimited, the National Black Growers Council, and we also had, as part of the event, not part of the project, but some folks from Tyson, some folks from an outfit called Windrock International, which works internationally on environmental service markets and things. And one of the most poignant parts of the event, the Secretary moderated a roundtable similar to this one, was P.J. Haney, the president of the National Black Growers Council, talking about how this funding opportunity, this collaborative partnership that came together to get this award to Arkansas, forced and facilitated a whole bunch of conversations between individual growers, between stakeholder groups, trade groups, that had never happened before because of how we structured it. Those are the kind of things that we feel like we want to see more of at USDA. And the Arkansas example was just one. And the other quick one that I'll mention, the largest agency at USDA most people don't realize is the U.S. Forest Service. We have about 600 million acres of private forest land in this country, almost 200 million acres of national forests. One of the most important things we've done, I think, since the Biden administration came in terms of collaboration with stakeholders, has been to bring Native American communities back into the discussion about how to manage forests. Folks who are here for tens of thousands of years, grew up with fire, grew up managing wildlife. We've gone through a stakeholder process to incorporate a lot of that indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge into our management prescriptions, into the way that we do business. We're signing all sorts of co-stewardship agreements with our tribal partners. That's been a really important and enjoyable piece of my work, and I think is a good lesson for folks in this room and part of this discussion that you've got to reach outside of the traditional folks we've always collaborated with. We're going to need that diversity and that strength in diverse opinions as we move forward into kind of an uncertain future.
Yeah.
So we're collaborating a lot with USDA, and I want to go back to Dr. Fowler's comments about February 24th, because it's probably what led, that's where the story began. I was sitting in Zug, Switzerland on February 24th. If you don't know anything about Zug, Switzerland, it's like the mineral trading capital of the world. And I was there to visit several of our Russian fertilizer companies, members. It was like walking into a funeral that morning. It was quite depressing. And what transpired, of course, over the next few weeks was this real spotlight on how do we manage and sanctions and those types of things. And so Charlotte, I know, is here, one of my colleagues from the International Fertilizer Association. You know, some of my partner associations had to make decisions about whether we continue to even allow engagement with some of these companies anymore. Challenging situation. U.S. government chose not to sanction some of that products because they knew how critical it was to food security, and so they exempted food and fertilizer from anything tied up in that conflict. But it did really bring to light a question. You talk about your farmers calling you about fertilizers. I had congressmen calling me about fertilizers because your farmers were calling them about fertilizers. I used to love to ask the question.
That's good.
I used to love asking members of Congress what they're hearing about in their constituency, because it was health care and taxes. And when that changed to fertilizer, I was like, never mind, I don't want to know anymore. But what it did is it highlighted a question that kept coming up, and that is, well, why don't we have more domestic fertilizer in the U.S.? And 90% of all fertilizer is consumed outside the U.S. It is truly a global market. And so that was what led to Secretary Vilsack's announcement at Steve's meeting in March in New Orleans to invest $250 million in expanding fertilizer production. President Biden echoed that in Illinois on a farm to double it to $500 million. And I can tell you the fertilizer industry is really excited about it. And it's a great opportunity to partner with the government to look at investments in innovation and in technology. And I suspect that's where a lot of that will go. Just because, you can't, a lot of people think you can just turn on, a potash mine, just turn that dial up. And I think a new potash mine that's coming online in Saskatchewan is costing $10 billion. That gives you perspective of what 500 million versus 10 billion will pay for. But nonetheless, it's a great partnership. Companies are very excited about what that will lead to. And I think that's what spurs innovation, creativity, but also stewardship. We made our climate commitment around acres of farmland for our nutrient stewardship management last year during Global Fertilizer Day, to hit 70 million acres by 2030. And part of that criteria includes use of variable rate technology or application, but also some of these innovative products and things that we're working with USDA and EPA on.
Excellent. Steve, any initiatives?
Yeah, some really great partnerships, and one that I want to perhaps lead off with. One is that we in the soybean industry, and I use the collective we because we have several partner organizations. We have the United Soybean Board through our soybean checkoff, the U.S. Soybean Export Council, and the American Soybean Association through our World Initiative for Soy and Human Health. We've been investing in developing export markets, but also developing food chains around the world for a long time. And that is a partnership not only between soybean growers, but also with the U.S. government, using USDA funds that we receive through various programs, whether it's the Foreign Market Development Program, the Market Access Program, Food for Progress Program, in order to try to do that. And we're doing that and working to try to develop value chains that not only will these markets be eventually, hopefully, be markets for U.S. soy, but also improving nutrition and improving the success of agriculture farmers in those developing and emerging markets where it is so key. Just a couple of examples. One is through our World Initiative for Soy and Human Health. We have been working in Cambodia and working to develop a Cambodian Aquaculturalist Association, sharing technology on how they can increase their fish production using soy, but it's making them more profitable. They've increased their production and better feeding their people. And that's a win-win situation that we're out there. We also have worked in Ghana as another example with a grant that we had received from USDA through Food for Progress, as well as a checkoff from soybean farmers' own money to invest there in Ghana, and working to expand poultry and egg production there within Ghana. And that too has been a success, where we have increased egg consumption within Ghana by about 30% over a few years. And that really is improving, of course, the protein, the nutrition of the people, making the farmers, the poultry farmers in Ghana more successful, and better feeding the people, but also creating a long-term demand. And that's the kinds of things that we're interested in continuing to do around the world, and is really important for not only improving food security, but also building those value chains that are successful, not just with aid, but with development, and helping the farmers and develop those value chains in the developing countries. And I think that those kinds of partnerships are very important. The last thing maybe I'll mention, and I just want to go back, Sean has talked a lot about the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, and like Sean, I'm really excited about that. I think we're going to learn a lot. We're going to learn about what kinds of practices and incentives do farmers respond well to that really help them implement these more resilient practices that I talked about at the beginning, as well as what moves the needle. A big component with that USDA has in there is measurement and evaluation to make sure that we're capturing and measuring what are the impacts of some of these practices, and how can that not only achieve the climate benefits that we want in terms of carbon sequestration, but also are there other benefits, water quality, what does it do to productivity, and help farmers be more resilient. And I'm hopeful that some of the lessons that we learn here in the United States have applicability overseas as well, and that can be shared.
Yeah, no, excellent. And I was just looking at the time. We're pretty close, but I want to make sure we leave enough time for live Q&A from our audience. Any questions from our audience? Yes.
Good morning. As we begin to innovate, how do you see urban agriculture playing a role to address food needs with more dense population and those types of statements?
Great question.
Can you?
Yeah. How do we collaborate and integrate urban agriculture with well?
How do we begin to see the role of urban agriculture playing a role to address these food needs in large population centers where people are, versus still keeping a mind frame of everything taking place on the farm in a rural setting, to where we're able to cut down on carbon miles and things of that nature?
Great question. We didn't really touch on urban agriculture at all. But.
No, we didn't. But actually, there were in the last farm bill that was passed that Sean worked on, and his boss, Chairwoman Stabenow, included a number of provisions on urban agriculture to try to incentivize and provide support for more urban agriculture development. We are seeing, as you all know well, we're seeing the growth of some of these vertical farms that are near urban centers, and that can cut down on the food miles. But I go back to what we're going to need in addition to a cheap energy source, goes back to energy and the impacts that energy has on agriculture production. But in order for them to be successful and to move beyond the microgreens that they're producing right now, or in some cases maybe some tomato production, things like that. If we're going to produce more crops, we're going to need more innovation, and that's going to be through plant breeding, gene editing, perhaps biotechnology that allow us to adapt those plants to grow better in those indoor environments. And right now we're not there. We're doing microgreens.
I just
say that it's such an important part of this discussion that we're having about how do we move into the future and feed more people with, frankly, in an imperative where we need to have fewer emissions, food traveling less distances, and no more new land, right? I mean, they're not making more of it, not much. And we've got a significant challenge, and we've got breaking new land all over the world has challenges, significant challenges that we always have to think about here. So at USDA, we think about how do we increase the productivity on the acres that we do have in production? And we're going to need all of those acres plus new opportunities like urban farming, like you asked about. And just appreciate Steve's recognition of the last farm bill. Obviously, I think many folks in the room know that Congress does a farm bill about every 5 years, really guides the vast majority of the policy, at least our mostly domestic, but some international ag policy. We just completed one in 2018, had a robust urban ag component to it, and starting probably right after the election, we'll start talking about really what the 2023 Farm Bill will look like, I think, as most folks anticipate. So anyway, thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Could I
go
just
ahead,
mention one
Dr.
thing?
Fowler. Yeah.
While we easily speak of a global food crisis, we have to realize that there's no such thing as a global food system. There are many different systems operating out there. So in terms of urban agriculture, you can see the whole span from some of the work that is going on in the United States. I've recently visited a vertical farm in New Jersey. They're exploring that big time in some of the Gulf states and Mideast, but also in developing countries. A third of the land area of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, is under cultivation during some part of the year. To me, that represents a great contribution to food security. That's food that you're growing, it's right outside your door. And in a world where 60% of the food insecure people are living in conflict areas, that often means you have supply disruptions, particularly going into urban areas. Urban food production is, in fact, important. Steve, however, mentioned one of the drawbacks there, or one of the obstacles, or one of the challenges that we have, and that is that we will need, if we really want to maximize the impact of urban agriculture, particularly in developing countries, we'll need more efforts devoted towards plant breeding of the types of crops that are grown in those urban gardens. And we can't assume at this point that those crops, which are receiving very little in terms of research dollars, are going to be adapted to the kinds of climates that we see evolving.
Yeah. I know we have a question in the back, and then this woman as well next.
Yeah, I wanted to it's exciting to hear about the Climate Smart Commodities program and the research that's going on there. I would ask, how are these new opportunities being connected to existing programs within, say, USDA, like what ARS is doing and what NIFA is doing with addressing some of these productivity needs and buoying that research along with these new exciting programs? How is that connection being made, and how is that being sustained through some of these ongoing activities?
Well, I'll take a quick first crack at it. I think, our research mission areas, our research agencies within our research mission area have been thinking about climate for a long time. USDA has a network of climate hubs that are spread across the country, and the goal of these is to provide technical assistance to producers who are looking to increase their resiliency, or even just challenged by some of the sort of the new normal when we think about weather and impacts that we started the session with. So there's a lot of collaboration already happening between producers and USDA on the impact side. One of the cool things, and Steve sort of alluded to this earlier about the partnerships program, is at its core, it's a pilot. We're asking folks to try new things. We're putting some federal sort of dollars on the table. They're bringing private sector dollars, technical assistance, et cetera. We're going to try some things out. Some are going to work, others might not pan out how we think they will, but it's going to guide how we administer future, certainly research dollars, but also just conservation dollars, right? We haven't referenced in this panel, it's notable though that Congress recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, provided $40 billion to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to focus on climate change, and 20 billion of those dollars, roughly a little short of that, go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service to administer their traditional conservation programs, EQIP, CSP, RCPP, ASEP, but with a focus on those really climate beneficial practices. What we learn in partnerships over the next 2, 3, 4 years are going to inform that 10-year spending window that money is going to be deployed through. So a lot happening, and I think that between all the research, and I saw Dr. Jacobs Young out in the hall, our Undersecretary for Research is here doing some other panels today. We're having a lot of great across the department conversations about how we can make sure we're all leveraging the work that's going on and singing from the same song sheet, as it were.
Another question?
Yeah, thanks. You've talked a lot about collaboration and innovation to improve productivity, to improve crop yields. I've only heard the word nutrition about 3 times in this presentation, and I don't think we can separate a global food crisis from a global nutrition crisis when you've got billions of people with micronutrient deficiencies. And I know Dr. Fowler's a fan of orphan crops that are very nutritious, but I'd love to hear you speak about the nutrition aspect of the food crisis, because you can't ignore that.
Yeah. Who wants to take the first stab?
I might say, starting out from the soybean perspective and from soybean farmers, obviously, we have been doing work on the role that soy protein plays in a healthy diet. And as you know, we see when there's protein deficiencies, there's stunting, reductions in IQ for school-age children, things like that. And we have been working to say, how can we introduce plant-based, soy-based protein into traditional products that folks use, whether that's cassava or whether that's in flour blends, other feeding, other ways, beverages, to try to bring protein into those diets. We've had some good success as well. We've implemented some projects in the past, going back to partnerships, the McGovern-Dole International School Feeding Program, where we have been able to work in some countries to introduce the soy protein into those diets, and we see that as so important. But your overall point about the need for enhanced nutrition is there, and I do think that goes back, again, through some of what we're going to, the potential that for biotechnology and gene editing, not only to have crops that better withstand pests or drought, weather changes, but also to enhance the nutrition profile of the existing crops, has really a tremendous amount of potential.
You may not know I'm sitting next to the head of Harvest Plus.
We have one more question over here that we can take, but does anybody else want to address nutrition? All right, we'll take our last question here. Really appreciate everyone. Great questions.
Well, first, thanks to each of you for highlighting the importance of agricultural research and all of the good work that needs to be done. This year's laureate is Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig, and she's being honored in part for all of the good work she's done bringing the agricultural and climate modeling communities together to help address these challenges. But one of the challenges with modeling is it can be disconnected, it can be disparate, and frankly, it can be hard to understand. So a question is, from each of your respective positions, how can we harness the larger agricultural and climate communities, the modeling communities, to help make that bridge between the science and the research and the action problems that need to be addressed?
Someone will. The saying goes, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." Is that right? I think we've certainly been grappling with this question when we think about the sustainability and climate work we're doing. There is an imperative that's been handed down by Secretary Vilsack and really President Biden and his team that when we think about monitoring and evaluating the benefits of these sustainable production practices, whether they be for climate, water quality, wildlife habitat, we need to do it accurately. And if we don't know it accurately, if those error bars are really high, we need to acknowledge that and invest in a way to do it better. So, we've talked a lot about the partnerships program. Steve mentioned that there's a important component around measurement, monitoring, verification, and all those projects. We have a whole effort underway at USDA with our Office of Chief Economists and others to think about how do we make those error bars smaller? How do we really hone in on accuracy in this? Because at the end of the day, the benefit you're trying to achieve to the environment, they don't care what's on paper. They care what's happening in reality. The climate doesn't care if you say you reduce this many million metric tons, but in reality, some of that went back up in the air, or, that digester didn't work, or that lagoon never was sealed, or whatever the example is. So we've got a robust body of work in that space. I think we're going to need help, and we're going to need to work with our land-grant universities, with the private sector. We've seen a lot of innovation in this space. I remember when I started working on some of these issues, you'd have to get a really accurate measure of soil carbon, you'd have to do an $11 soil sample every 40 acres or something like that, and then send them to a lab. It takes a couple weeks, it comes back, and to really get an accurate count, it was quite expensive. Now, even just in the last few years, I think we've seen tons of innovation there. So hopefully that continues in other arenas, but it's an important issue to raise in this discussion.
The only thing I might add to that is just that you underscored the importance of systems approaches and systems teams where you bring in the disciplines and the expertise from lots of different people to work on these problems because they are so complex, and we need the modelers as part of those teams.
Yeah, I'll just mention that I'll try to actually address the last question and the question before that and link the two. When we talk about agricultural development, we really need to start with the question of nutrition. That's where it ought to start. It's not simply a challenge that we face today of calories or even protein. It starts with a more complete definition of nutrition, and that's what we ought to be aiming for in terms of our agricultural development. If we do that, what I think we will inevitably end up doing is focusing more attention on some crops that have had less attention shown on them in the recent past. And if we do that in the context of climate change, I think what that means is that we have to get busy in making the kind of research investments that will help those crops that are vitally important for nutrition but haven't been invested in up to the level that they deserved in the past. We'll be putting more money into research into those crops to help them adapt to the climate change that's on our doorstep.
Well, I know we're between you and lunch today, but I want to say, this has been a critically important conversation, and I really appreciate our panelists and their thoughts and leadership in this space. Can we give a thank you, a warm welcome, or thank you to our panelists? And thank you, everyone, for coming here today.